Welcome to this edition of the Tri-Wad Walk online lecture series. Today we will focus on relational values in Wadden Sea nature conservation. The key question here is how and why we value nature in particular ways. I will not be talking about monetary value, but more about the different range of values related to and implicit in nature conservation practices. So, from my own research and in various interviews in different contexts, I've come across different understandings and different perceptions of value at the Wadden Sea. So in this first quote here from a research interview with an NGO in Husum in 2017, we have this idea that it is much easier to objectify nature conservation goals when I don't have to make them arbitrarily. I let nature decide. So this is saying that nature is independent of our values in a sense, that it's something that's objective and that's how it should be in nature conservation. On the right here we have the director of the Wadden Sea Visitor Centre in Cuxhaven in the context of a university field trip. He argued that nature conservation is in fact not a science, it is much more ideology, referring to how different approaches to nature conservation have changed over time, and in particular the legal definitions and concepts and frameworks that they have changed in some cases over quite short space of time, of years or indeed decades as well, that there have been very substantial changes in terms of which nature we protect and why. So we can think about what is the nature of the Wadden Sea? What is it that we wish to protect? Is it natural processes, ecosystem integrity, biodiversity, species, individuals perhaps, individual seals maybe, or indeed the landscape? What I present today is based primarily on my own research in this context at the Wadden Sea, which is focused on nature-culture relations, and this was funded primarily through a German research foundation, DFG project from 2016 to 2020, focused on Wadden Sea metageographies. And there have been a number of outputs from this and related work with colleagues in related areas, including a special issue of the journal Area on cultural geographies of coastal change, a special issue of maritime studies published last year on beyond nature and culture, relational perspectives on the Wadden Sea landscape, and then also individual journal articles in ocean and coastal management, rural landscapes, and a book chapter on landscape imaginaries or landscape Landschaftsbilder in German. So recently there has been increased attention paid to values in nature conservation and different types of values, and this is quite a intensive discussion currently, both scientifically and of course with policy implications as well. So here's just one example of a key text within this area by Kai Chan et al., Why You Protect Nature, Rethinking Values and the Environment. And here we have a distinction between intrinsic value, the idea that nature has value independent of people, which we could say is associated with an ecocentric approach. But here, of course, moral values also play a role. We have concepts of instrumental value, being in seeing you or using nature brings pleasure or satisfaction to people. So this is more anthropocentric, related, for example, to the concept of ecosystem services. And here the term hedonic values is often used. And a third strand here then is relational values, and it's relational values which is currently receiving more attention. This has to do with preferences, principles, virtues, also ideas associated with relationships, both interpersonal and as articulated by policies and social norms. That in itself doesn't tell us very much, but part of this debate is asking how or if relational values can be quantified, and if that is sensible. Looking at meaningfulness as a third pillar. So why is nature meaningful to people? I think that's quite a useful approach. Also, ideas around caring for nature and why caring matters and how to develop an ethic of care, very relevant at the Wadden Sea as well. We can say as well that in much of this research it is argued that values are relational and also performative in a sense, that the values they are given, that matters also in decision-making processes for particular reasons. So it's really this area that I focus on in my research. Moving out a little bit more, we can situate this in broader debates going back a few more years, looking at the concept of nature itself. Nature is a powerful discursive category, and one whose meaning has varied substantially across time and space. This is coming in particular from a cultural anthropology and also political ecology perspectives. So this idea that nature is not a thing in itself, but it's more a discursive category which has its own power. But nevertheless, the meaning of which is not easy to identify and actually shifts across space and time. At the same time, we can say that the nature of nature conservation takes on a strategic essentialist identity. This idea that it's that nature becomes reified in its sense, it becomes a thing, something that is not just socially constructed, but a thing within particular discourses. And that's what gives it power then as well. But we need to be careful of that and look at it critically. So within current debates on the Anthropocene in particular, there is a lot of discussion about moving beyond nature, in particular moving beyond an essentialist idea of nature, viewing nature and culture as entangled or intertwined. In particular, Bruno Latour and also Jamie Lorimer have argued that the Anthropocene is multinatural, similar to the way we would say that we live in a multicultural world, we also live in a multinatural world. So what can this mean? This is really about displacing an idea of universal nature that is known by science to saying that it's much more plural, that there's a diversity of different perspectives, different ways of knowing nature. That's really at the essence of what we're talking about here. In my own work, I've argued as well that we can talk about maybe moving away from a universal idea of nature to place-based natures. That if we say nature is contingent, that it's context sensitive, then that it's also fundamentally embedded in places. So if we're thinking nature relationally, then we can say that it's a social construct, but also a powerful discursive category. And I think very importantly that nature-society relations are actively negotiated through conservation practices. So this is something that also comes from the political ecology literature in particular, that through protected area management, that different ideas about nature and society, nature and culture are actively negotiated. And I think that really matches up with how things happen in practice as well, and how nature and also culture, a social identity, how they become or receive a place-specific contextual meaning as well. Applied scientific thinking in this context is also imbued with social values, not only traditional ecological knowledge. We are aware that behind traditional ecological knowledge lies cultural values, but we can say that the same actually applies to scientific thinking as well in many respects. So this idea that ecosystems in some way function analogous to society, that they have a similar level of coherence maybe, that some concepts apply, that we have this idea of a system that is there, and we need to think critically about where these ideas come from, whether there are in fact functional linkages, and that of course is an empirical question, not something we should take for granted. Similarly with assumptions of equilibrium and balance, to what extent are they coming from human ideas, from other fields, perhaps. Also with the idea of the possibility of a return to pure or pristine nature, again, there are cultural values implicit in such statements or such concepts as well that we need to be very aware of. So when we think nature conservation relationally, then we can say that protected areas are the products of global discourses and local practices. So there is a complex spatial dimension here as well, that protected area management is fundamentally related to processes of interlinkage between the local and the global. And this is something which environmental historians in particular have emphasized. So ideas around relational space. We have then, as mentioned already, this idea that nature-society relations and the meanings attributed to nature are actively contested and negotiated. So we can term this relational nature. And then again, we can say that all nature values are in some sense relational and also performative. So relational values. So we can think conceptually, we can think of nature conservation in terms of relational space, relational nature, and relational values. I think this is a useful framework for trying to critically understand current practices of nature conservation and protected area management. From the political ecology literature, we know that national parks can be seen as spatial practices, sites of active negotiation. For Bill Adams and co-authors, they said that it's about the conceptual and practical placing of nature within spatial bounds. And it's clear that there is a lot of boundary work happening, that the role of designating particular boundaries has certain effects. Tom Mells, in the Swedish context, he argued that nature is taken from its social context and place, meaningful place, becomes abstract space. So this is part of the transformation that occurs when nature is taken out of its surrounding cultural context through the designation of protected areas. And this is parallels to Patrick Cooper, an environmental historian, his work on the creation of wilderness through the Swiss National Park. And he really looks at the history of the national park and how they set out to create and protect wilderness through the designation of, or the establishment of very strict boundaries around an area that was cut out from the surrounding cultural landscape. So we can say that protected areas reinforce nature-culture dichotomies in the landscape. So they create a sharp separation which is artificial, which has not been there before. Or they reinforce a separation between areas for nature and areas for culture. And my research has shown this also to be the case at the Wadden Sea as well. Relational perspectives, however, can help to foster connectivities, to emphasize the relations across the dike boundary, for example, the relations between the national park and the hinterland, between cultured nature and nature-culture landscapes, between the land and the sea. Much of my understanding about nature values is also influenced by the German language discussion. And one of the key authors here is Reinhard Pichotzi, who has written about and critically discussed which nature we protect and why, and looking at different ideas such as landscape, heimat or place attachment, and wilderness, and what role they've played in nature conservation in past decades as well. And here it's clear that nature's intrinsic value is not self-evident. We cannot speak for nature. So we need to ask then more critically, why is nature meaningful to people? Why do we want to protect it? Even if it is for scientific reasons, this why question is still relevant. Why do we wish to protect which nature then as well? Moving from the conceptual to the empirical, we can see how these abstract questions of nature-society relations play out in protected area management of the Wadden Sea. Firstly, in Schleswig-Holstein, here we have a national park that was established in 1985 with a long history of community opposition. The municipalities at the coast and on the islands were opposed to the creation of a national park in the 1980s. Here we have a strict separation of spaces for nature and culture, with, for example, the inhabited islands and the coastal hinterland on the mainland excluded, not part of the national park area. Here the underlying conservation philosophy is one of letting nature be nature. This means minimal intervention, a more passive approach to nature conservation. This idea, however, this concept of the Wadden Sea as a natural landscape is one that is very much contested locally among the coastal communities. This quote here dates from 1974, before the establishment of the national park. And here it was argued that the Wadden Sea is not an original natural landscape, but a cultural landscape lost to the sea. In one form or another, the Frisian inhabitants have paid for the Wadden Sea. And this is reflecting on the history of a landscape that has been transformed dramatically over time through catastrophic storm floods in the Middle Ages, but also through land reclamation and dike building and drainage. So also human practices as well. Here, it is argued in this case that it is the Frisians, the local communities, who are primarily entitled to decide about the Wadden Sea, so arguing for a more local approach and associating it with a Frisian cultural identity as well. So really questioning the separation between nature and culture. Within the National Park Law from 1985, and that's on the other hand, it's very clearly about the preservation of the unique character of the Wadden Sea, of its beauty and originality or pristine character. The policy vision for the protection of the national park is oriented towards a historic scenario, the Wadden Sea as a natural landscape. The comparison of the ecosystem of today with a real natural condition makes current deviations visible. This statement from an ecosystem census report published in 1996 makes very clear how the vision of the national park is oriented and influenced by particular ideas about nature, and what is understood as a real natural condition, and that today the current state is a deviation then from that. This idea of an idealized historic scenario. On the other hand, however, we have, from an ecological perspective, we know that really the nature of the Wadden Sea today is the product of contingent, path-dependent interactions between human and natural processes over a period of thousands of years. And Carson Rice and his research at the Wadden Sea has really shown this to be the case. And from this perspective, it is impossible to know how the Wadden Sea would have developed in the absence of human influence. We simply don't know what the Wadden Sea would be like today if it is in a natural state. So this really influences how we think and should think about Wadden Sea nature as well. I will move on here, and recently, just 6 years ago, the then director of the national park spoke of the Wadden Sea in Schleswig-Holstein still in terms of a primordial wilderness. So it's very clear that this discourse is still current. The Wadden Sea is one of the few natural landscapes in Europe which is still over a large area primordial and to a great extent unchanged by man. We will continue to work together so that the wild originality or pure nature of the Wadden Sea National Park is preserved. So here we can see that through conservation policy and practice that dichotomies, a sharp separation between nature and culture are reproduced in fact. At the Danish Wadden Sea we have quite a different approach. In here the relationship between nature and culture is more explicit and emphasized and really at the forefront of the story that they wish to tell through the Danish National Park. So here it is argued that the migration birds for us, that was the biggest nature telling story about the Wadden Sea. That is our story. So we can see the global meaning of this area and the global value in this story. So on the one side there is a global meaning to this story about the migrating birds. But, and this is a former director of the Wadden Sea Centre there speaking, but we had to bring the birds near to the people. I think it's very important to understand that you must see and feel the beauty of the Wadden Sea to understand it. So to really understand it, you need to bring it near to the people to make these connections. So here we see the relational connections between the local and the global, and this idea of bringing nature into the realm of the people to make it understandable and accessible as well. Here again it is argued that for many people it's nearly maniac or crazy to fly so many kilometers only to get one chicken. But the story is somehow very beautiful. And we can relate to this because in every person we like to travel, and this bird has travelled so many kilometers, crossing so many countries, so many cultures, so many dangers. Again, in this interview, it's making these connections between the visitors to the Wadden Sea, who have in many cases travelled long distances as well, making connection between these visitors and then the birds as well, who in a sense are also visitors to the Wadden Sea, and that we can relate to their experience maybe in some way. In the Danish context also, it is argued that there's a fear of moving sand. We are really afraid of sand moving and also flooding. It's in our blood in this part of the country. But with the national park, it is argued that they can set some dunes free, so to speak. But it's again a change in our minds that's, sand is moving. And here it was argued that there are biodiversity reasons for allowing sand dunes to become more mobile. But to effect change, it's much more a cultural question, a change in our minds. So to do this, you need to come with different arguments. And this shows the interrelationship between nature conservation and cultural values and local cultural perceptions quite well, I think. And here we have two different approaches at the Danish Wadden Sea and then in Schleswig-Holstein, just across the border, the area where we were for a second tri-wad walk, and very different approaches to nature conservation in each context. One emphasizing the separation of nature and culture through the national park, the other really much more about the connections. And I think it's very important that we as researchers, that we critically analyze these differences, that we look at them and reflect and see why that is the case, and what that means in practice as well, and what that means for our theoretical or conceptual understanding of nature-society relations. So to conclude then for this session, I would argue that taking relational value seriously implies recognition of multiple ways of knowing nature. I think this is really critical, this idea of an epistemological pluralism, that there's not just one scientific way of knowing nature. The nature is something that is diverse, it's plural. It is, we can really think of a with Jamie Lorimer and Bruno Latour of a multi-natural world. And this means a certain richness as well, that biodiversity is related to cultural diversity also. That natural heritage is intrinsically related to cultural heritage. I would also argue quite strongly that society-space and society-nature relations are actively negotiated through protected area management. And that means that they are dynamic processes where the meaning of particular concepts is at play. And if we have open management and governance structures, then there are more possibilities for transformation, essentially, and thinking things differently, and maybe emphasizing the connections more between processes of nature conservation within the protected area and processes of socio-ecological transformation within a wider regional context. So I would argue really here for a broader relational perspective, focusing on space, nature, and values, rather than focusing simply on relational values. That each of these aspects are fundamentally intertwined, and that we need to look critically in terms of how they are debated and discussed and enacted then through protected area management practices. So thank you for your attention. I hope that was useful. I tried to build a bridge here between quite abstract concepts, abstract social theory discussions on nature and nature-society relations, and on the other side, concrete practices of nature conservation, and emphasizing particular differences on the ground within the wider context of Wadden Sea nature conservation. That the nature of what we are protecting at the Wadden Sea, it's not maybe quite as simple as straightforward as we think it is, and that there are critical questions there that are very relevant for practice as well as we move forward. So thank you for listening, and hopefully it has provided some food for thought as well.